I will probably suggest to let them in, no?
Yes.
Facciamo entrare tutti? We let them in?
Okay.
So, when you will see yourself on air, Marilda, you can talk to anyone, to
Okay.
everybody. And remind them to keep speaker view. Thank you very much. Have a good work.
Thank you to you. Thank you. Okay. So, good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining our online press conference. My name is Marilda Notte, and I'm the Director of Communication for Voices of Faith. I will moderate today's press conference. And before we begin, a few technical details. I recommend you to set up your screen in speaker view. And as you probably know, our interpreters will be providing simultaneous interpretation in other two languages, Italian and German. The interpretation channels are available by clicking on the globe icon at the center of your screen. For now, I ask you to keep your microphone mute. We will give you the floor at the end of the speaker's speeches. So let's start. This year, Voices of Faith decided to join the UN Women 16 Days of Activism against gender-based violence from November 25th to December 13th. According to a 1998 study, 30% of the sisters had experienced one or more forms of sexual abuse, mostly at the hands of priests, but occasionally also at the hands of outsiders or even fellow sisters. How will these survey results look today, November 2021? On 2019, Pope Francis has acknowledged for the very first time the sexual abuse of women religious in the Catholic Church. On his flight back from Abu Dhabi in 2019, he commented on case of slavery to women in the Catholic Church. He said, yes, it's true. It affects many in the Catholic Church. It's not that everybody does it, but there are priests and bishops who have done it. I cannot say that this has not happened in the Catholic Church. Yes, it is true. And yes, we want and need to do more. The Vatican has been working on this for a long time, Pope Francis said. After almost 3 years, we are asking religious sisters about this growing protection from the Vatican. It seems that many women, religious, former religious and lay, have had a different experience and won't confirm that the Vatican is doing more to protect them. No, the opposite we heard. We state that the hierarchy is actually still ignoring the abusing against women. The same terrible silence surrounds women in their communities, local churches, and cultures. Our campaign, Enough, is shooting out the pain, the anger, the nightmares of these wounded women. We say enough of declarations of intent also on the part of Pope. In the upcoming 9 online conversations, we will dig very deep into the characteristics of abuse, especially spiritual abuse. But Voices of Faith will also address the human rights issue. We are raising the question, why do human rights stop at the front door of the Catholic Church? But please have a look at our event teaser, and I recommend you to put the screen in speaker view. Okay, let's start. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our today's speakers. Sister Mumbi Kigutha. Welcome, sister, a member of the Sisters of the Precious Blood, Ohio, author, theologian, and activist, joined us from Chicago. She's also a consultant for Jesuit Refugee Service. Welcome, sister. Professor Ute Leimgruber joins us from Germany, where she's leading the Department of Pastoral Theology and Homiletics at the University of Regensburg, co-editor of the widely discussed book, Narration as Resistance, dedicated to the violence against adult women in the Church. Welcome, Professor Ute. And Sister Noella de Souza, a member of the Missionaries of the Child Jesus and one of the founders of the Indian Christian Women Movement. Welcome, Sister Noella. So we are going to have 40 minutes at the end of the presentation for your questions, and I welcome your comments as well. So, Sister Mumbi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Physical, sexual, verbal, psychological, financial, identity abuse are all very much present in our spaces of faith, in the church, in our institutions, in religious life. Think of power. Add to that a lack of transparency and accountability, and you will definitely find some abuse happening. We know that a sizable number of religious women around the world have suffered abuse of various micro and macro aggressions, and some may be cognizant that it was abuse and others not. But true to the cycles of abuse, sometimes those victims become perpetrators as well to fellow sisters and others. It becomes hard to name and call out abuse because of the complexities of the situation, the lack of understanding, the fear of consequences, which sometimes cause more suffering to the victims, but also because of the culture of silence perpetuated by our systems, structures, and policies within the church. Other factors that contribute to abuse are a skewed understanding of our vows, of religious life, of leadership, poor theology, and a lack of mechanisms and resources to address abuse. And let us not forget to mention victim shaming, silencing, and shunning. Many times, victims will suffer from a combination of different forms of abuse. And that is why an intersectional approach must be taken to address this virulent problem, cleaning out our own houses, our own institutions, even as we challenge the abuse we may receive from others outside of our own congregations. What do I mean by a combination of abuses? Racism, for instance, is a form of identity abuse that occurs in our faith spaces, and this can range from racial slurs, which is also a type of verbal abuse, to being treated differently from the majority group. So it could mean that some of your basic needs are not met, which is also psychological abuse, to being forced to assimilate, and not so long ago, for many congregations with roots in the Northern Hemisphere, denying women of color entry to religious life. Abuse within a religious group, whether psychological, verbal, financial, can make a sister more prone to sexual abuse from an outside party because of their vulnerability. My hope is that our growing network can spark a movement globally that will ignite religious women to speak out about abuse and our own complicity in it, and reclaim the true life-giving identity of religious life. Thank you.
And it's also our hope. Thank you, sister. Thank you, Sister Mumbi. So now please join me in welcome Professor Ute Leimgruber from Germany. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you. Es gibt Gewalt gegen Frauen in der katholischen Kirche. In Deutschland, in Europa, weltweit. Frauen werden in finanzielle und emotionale
Violence when it comes to women in Catholic Church. In Germany, Europe, worldwide, everywhere. Women are forced into financial and emotional addictions. They are spiritually indoctrinated and manipulated. They are physically exploited and raped. The few attempts to make the crimes public came to nothing for decades. At this point, I'm thinking, for example, of Maura Donoghue, an Irish religious woman from the Order of the Medical Missionaries of Mary, who was sent to Rome in 1994 and described dramatic crimes against women religious around the world. There were regrettably no consequences on the part of the responsible. There have been a few scientific studies in the English-speaking world since the late 1990s. They affirm that violence against women in the church is not isolated and make it clear that it's a global phenomenon. They too received no significant response. Since the 2000s, several reports have appeared from former women documenting these abuses, sexual and spiritual, and still hardly any reactions from church officials came. It was not until 2019 that Pope Francis spoke up and condemned this enslavement of these women in the church. In Germany, the abuse of children and adolescents has been in the focus of the public audience since 2010. The view of women as victims of this sexual and spiritual violence only followed around for 10 years after that. Last year, under my co-editorship and in cooperation with the Catholic German Women's Association, a book project was realized that was first ever to compile these reports from women who experienced these terrible abuses. So 3 brief insights from the book came. It can happen to any women, first things first. The reports come from women in religious orders and women outside the orders, from single living and family women, heterogeneous in terms of age, education, or origin.
Erfahren den Missbrauch auch deswegen, weil sie Frauen sind.
Abuse in the church is mostly a combination of spiritual and sexual abuse. This is a fundamental disregard for the sexual or spiritual rights of self-determination. Number 3, of course, the abuse of adult women in church context is gender-based violence. Another reason women experience abuse is because you know what they are women. So it is our task as scientists to investigate on this violence against women in the church, and this is the only way to end it.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. And now, Sister Noella, you have the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you to you.
Well, there's something very simple that I want to say, and it makes a lot of sense. There was recently a scientific study conducted amongst women religious in India, which was published in a booklet entitled "It's High Time, Women Religious Speak Out on Gender Justice in the Indian Church." The survey revealed many different areas of abuse meted out to women religious of India. To give you the different areas that were taken, there were property matters, where men kept the legal documents and refused many times to share it with the sisters concerned. Low wages, harassment and ignoring the competence of women. There was also what we call sacramental blackmailing, using the Eucharist and confession as tools of censure and punishment. Verbal abuse, both casually and from the pulpit. But here I just want to talk about how the sacraments, liturgy, vow, and virtues are used to manipulate religious sisters and to exercise power on them. For an instance that I would like to give, a superior of the community defied the parish priest and conducted a communion service. The priest came to the convent, locked the tabernacle, and gave the key to the bishop. Power is also used from the pulpit to humiliate, criticize, and belittle sisters. This is what I call sacramental hijacking. These priests misuse their power by using the sacraments to get even with the sisters, should they not be heeded and given the prestige and power they desire. At other times, the same power refuses to acknowledge the professional competence of the sisters, where oftentimes sisters are expected to give free service, particularly in the pastor sector. Unfortunately, from our side, from the sister side, we back this kind of behavior entirely. And in most cases, and through the widespread practice of the culture of silence in our convents, we are afraid. We are afraid we might be. However, here I cite just an example bringing in another dimension. When a provincial I know asked a community not to attend Mass because of the arrogant behavior of the priest concerned, the sisters turned around and told the priest that they didn't attend the Eucharist because the provincial didn't like the Eucharist. So you see, we are our own enemies at times. And once again, to keep in the good books of the clergy. These are just small examples about how gender roles are created and sustained in religious life. Thus, our sisters decorate altars, wash church linen, organize the flowers on the altar, decorate floats on feast days, and are expected to sponsor them financially too. I feel it important to talk about this abuse because there are a few things we need to tell the world. And one is that we're not going to be taken for a ride anymore. We are not those quiet, demure, sweet, and submissive types so many would still want today. On the contrary, we are assertive, adult, and can decide about our own future and mission. No more fathering. And I would also like to give a message to our brothers that it's time you left your male superiority and need for patriarchal control and prestige behind and thought of mutual respect and communion. Until now, there have been signs of change, but only on paper. It's time to act. Thank you.
Thank you, sister. Yes, in fact, this year, Voices of Faith has its focus on the issues of exploitation and abuse of religious sisters and created, as I said, a video series to help educate and explain situations and factors that can lead to various forms of abuse to vulnerable sisters. The objectives are to educate Catholic sisters on their rights and on how they can defend themselves against abuse and avoid a range of specific risks they are vulnerable to in their position as nuns. The main target of our videos are Catholic nuns all over the world, but there is also a wide audience Catholics around the world who sympathize with nuns and people in positions of power who may be part of the problem as well as part of the solution. As a side effect, the series also targets potential and actual abusers. This is an extremely diverse audience with an age range from 16 to 100. The only thing they all have in common is some more or less developed knowledge about Catholicism and the role and life of Catholic nuns. We will launch the videos in the upcoming events. I hope to see you in the upcoming events, but now just a little trailer.
Ja, guten Morgen. Hier ist die Schwester Philippa aus der Benediktinerinnenabtei St. Hildegard in Rüdesheim in Deutschland. Ich möchte mich ganz ausdrücklich solidarisieren mit allen Frauen auf der Welt, die in und außerhalb unserer katholischen Kirche geistig und geistlich missbraucht werden. Das ist ein ganz gravierender Verstoß gegen die Menschenwürde all dieser Frauen. Und ich verspreche allen mein Gebet und möchte den Heiligen Vater und die Bischöfe eindringlichst bitten, diesem Missbrauch Einhalt zu gebieten und überall auf der Welt unabhängige Stellen zu etablieren, an die sich die betroffenen Frauen und Ordensfrauen wenden können. Ich danke und grüße alle überall auf der Welt. Eure Schwester Philippa.
You could follow our initiatives and the full program on our social networks, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and also on our website. Don't forget to share our initiatives and to tag us as Voices of Faith Women. So now I want to take this opportunity to open it up from any questions. If you have questions for the speakers, you may raise your hand and ask the question in one of the 3 languages we have today. Just one logistical note: when you ask your question, first let us know who the question is directed to. Okay, you have the floor. So maybe, let us see. Okay, maybe I can start with a question especially for our sisters. And I would like to know more about spiritual abuse, what this means and what is the main issues of spiritual abuse for Catholic sisters, religious sisters, or lay women. Sister Noella or Sister Mumbi?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you. What of abuse?
Spiritual.
Spiritual abuse, yes.
Yes.
I don't mind. Sister, would you like to talk about it, or can I answer from my point of view?
Please go ahead.
When I talked of spiritual abuse, I talked of sacramental abuse, which is very important. When I talk of spiritual abuse, I think of the 3 vows also, and how we are taken for a ride, particularly the vow of obedience. And I like what has been said before. We have such a poor understanding of vows, of religious life, of theology. It's amazing because when one of the speakers before talked about a somewhat developed knowledge of catechism, not at all, because I don't think catechism asks anybody to abuse or be abused. So as far as I'm concerned, as far as I see it, we're meant to be living a spiritual life in action or whatever, but it is abused in all the senses that I have expressed before.
When I think of spiritual abuse, it can take many forms. And I think anecdotal evidence is the best. A sister going to confession, very vulnerable, putting out her entire story. And then that either is betrayed by the confessor to her formator, or the confessor now uses it to take advantage of the sister. Think of the vow of obedience, but even of poverty. When a sister needs some basic needs met, remember we think of equity, not equality. So a sister with a particular medical condition might need particular care that costs more than what is being provided to another sister. And then that is denied under the auspices of the vow of poverty. Our vows are not supposed to violate human rights and basic human rights. So every sister has a right to shelter, sufficient food, healthcare. Another form of spiritual abuse comes under that poor theology where we use this word redemptive suffering to justify all kinds of behaviors. There is suffering that every human being undergoes, but we always have to ask the question, is it necessary? Is there a way to mitigate it? Another form of spiritual abuse is how we completely dirty our sister's name, who might not be towing the line, so to speak. And so we create a reputation about this sister that follows her, even as she's transferred from community to community. What happens is that this sister starts being isolated because she never has a chance to be known on her own merit, but there's been a reputation created about her. We know in any informal group of people, outside of elected leaders, there are also informal leaders that various groups of people align themselves to. And these informal leaders have a lot of power to decide whether somebody gets accepted, gets shunned, gets maligned in any particular setting of people. The fact that we hardly ever have mechanisms to address this gossip that actually kills, and I'm going to quote Pope Francis, gossip kills. There is no way to address it. This can become the life of a sister, and these rumors can start at a very young age, and it becomes a thing that is used to define her for the rest of her life in religious life, to mention a few things.
Thank you. Thank you, sisters. I just
Ute, did you want to? Sorry, Ute, did you want to add something?
Oh, sorry, Ute.
Sehr gerne.
Sorry,
Ich würde gerne zu der zu spirituellem Missbrauch etwas hinzufügen. Ich denke aus
Yes, I'd like to add something as far as spiritual abuse is concerned. from our point of view, from a theological and scientific point of view, it is fundamental for everyone to understand that the sisters have a self-determination right. You know, what happens to them cannot be decided against their own will, their own wishes. So they must not be exploited from or abused from a spiritual point of view. That cannot be accepted. So the spiritual or sexual abuse are really central, are really a core issue.
Okay. Thank you.
I wanted to ask Sister Mumbi to develop a little bit what she already said, that I have, when I hear the stories of different abuses, I have this feeling that we are really in the, it's so overwhelming and so systemic. You mentioned that sometimes the victims of the abuse become perpetrators themselves, or that the vulnerability of a person who comes to confession or who shows this vulnerability to others is used then as a start for abuse. This we hear this a lot. I wanted to know, that's perhaps difficult question, how can we start to dismantle the system? I mean, how, from where you start the change? Because it's not only between each victim and perpetrator, but it's, yeah, it's wider.
I lost the connection at some point. Was that question addressed to me?
Yes.
Yes.
So I'll speak first of all about how I came to understand cycles of abuse, and that is really because of the charism of my congregation, which is reconciliation, which acknowledges that many of us move in between this place of victim to perpetrator, victim to perpetrator. And we can look at abuse in all spheres of society. That people who are likely to offend in their adult years have had some experience, usually of abuse in their younger years. So think of it in this way. A young person has grown up in a home where they are denied love and attention, etc. Maybe even suffering from physical abuse from their parents or other people in the family. Then they come to religious life at a tender age. And I bring in a bit of psychology here, that the mind of an 18-year-old 40 years ago is not the mind of an 18-year-old in this day and age. So that's another thing that we need to look at what is the minimum age we allow women to enter religious life. Do they really have the ability to be full agents of their own life, to make the right choices, especially when that lady has grown up in a society that is more restrictive, especially towards women. So societies with a lot of patriarchal and misogynistic trends. So already the orientation of this young lady is to be submissive, to be accepting of authority. And they come into formation, and some formation styles are literally almost meant to break your personality. And there's an old kind of poor theology where it was almost like, we need to break so we can remold you into the person you need to be. But true formation should really about be calling out the gifts we see present in that person and then helping them integrate. And every human being at some point becomes aware of what their weaknesses and strengths are. So by giving them the right tools. So I have come to believe that access to therapy is very key in formation, that to help look at all parts of your life until then and see where you need healing. And then, so now you come and you've been formed, you have lost your voice, and the fear of dismissal has kept you from speaking out, has made you very malleable, has made you accept a lot of things that perhaps you'd not have accepted if you were empowered, yes? And now your understanding of the value is also skewed, and you know when you're asked to do something, you have to say yes, even if your entire spirit does not agree with it. And this continues and continues. There's a chance that this orientation or induction by fire becomes then an unspoken policy. We see this in boarding school culture with hazing, that we haze newcomers because we were hazed in our own years. So what happens when this person who has gone through all this becomes a leader, becomes a person in charge of formation in future years? Pain that is not transformed is transferred. So chances of them also becoming abusers, because now they have a little bit of power and authority after years of not having any, are extremely high. Chances of a sister who's getting abused in a community, abusing workers in her place of ministry because that's the only place she has a sense of power, become very high. And stories abound. Stories abound of how rudely workers are treated, verbal abuse, sometimes even physical abuse, being denied their human rights. So where do we start? I think it's an understanding of, excuse me, the different contexts where this is happening. I still believe that it's easier to speak out when you're seated in certain parts of the world than others. Societies that are collective, the fear of losing that sense of community are very real and very high. How do we understand shame and scandal? I've run into situations where you find even lay people saying, oh, we can't talk about it. We cannot bring scandal onto the church. Yes? Not understanding that the church is us. And that if the church is not sustaining our human rights and promoting them, it needs to be called out. And so we see in individuals the church. We see in a priest the church. So we are all working to protect that identity. We see in a sister the church. We are working to protect that identity. So another thing that has lent itself to abuse is this placing on the pedestal that we put religious people and clergy. So we see them from the outside and they are pure, they are perfect, but we don't see the victim in them. And so there is a huge divide between the laity and religious, and we are not talking together. Another way I believe that this cycle will end is when women start to talk to one another. Even canon law recognizes religious women as laity, so we need to embrace that and see all women as our sisters. And there have been great strides that have happened in the public sphere through movements like Me Too that can teach us a lot about how to advocate for ourselves, how to become activists, but also having safe mechanisms to help victims heal from abuse. Because that 18-year-old that I mentioned who has gone through abuse and perhaps at the age of 30 thinks I need to leave or I need to choose a different way of life, perhaps never got a basic education after she entered. How is she going to live without resources to be able to, again, provide her own basic needs? How is she going to live without a support network? How is she going to live when her only option of a place to live is the very same community where now her reputation is under question because of choosing to live what is perceived a better form of life or vocation than the other vocations in the church? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
May I add to what Mumbi has said?
Sure.
How do we dismantle this, you ask? What surprised me at the beginning of this session was something Marilda said, a specific statistic. 30% of sisters have been sexually abused, and mostly by priests. I was surprised at the high incidence. It was really a surprise to me. And I think the first thing that we have to do to dismantle this is to dismantle clericalism. we have, as Mumbi has said, we have such a high idea of priests. They're the face of God. We cannot talk about them. We cannot we cannot lie about them. We cannot even talk the truth about them. So I would also add to that, that most, Mumbi has already mentioned it in a way, most of us come from very devout families. We have always been taught to respect priests. And, when we're singled out, we really like it because, it's the face of God talking to us. So I think with that kind of a background, we need to change our kind of catechism that we give. The catechism is the wrong word. We need to educate our people very, very differently, and we have to take it very seriously. Another thing what I want to say is, what is shame and scandal in the church? Who is scandalizing? And the fact is that we call out the scandal, for us is a plus point. We are loyal, what should I say, citizens of our church. And we are church. It's not the clergy who is the only church. So these are ways basically to end patriarchy, which for me is the biggest curse in the church. And also we need to build up a gender perspective, both in convents and in seminaries. We cannot do one without the other. I think so much for now. Yeah.
Thank you. Ute?
Thank you, Sister Ute.
Danke. Danke. Ich möchte das, was Schwester Mumbi und Schwester Noella gesagt haben, unbedingt unterstützen. Es darf kein Priester mehr Priester werden, wenn er nicht sich auseinandergesetzt hat mit den Rechten aller Menschen. Dazu gehören Frauenrechte und sich auseinandergesetzt
I would like to
hat.
support this concept, and no priest should ever face this thing, especially for the spiritual and sexual abuse. And how does this happen? We urgently need a good formation, let's say a training, an empowerment for our women team, and we need to be more sensibilized when it comes to priest choice and bishops. So it's a kind of ideological empowerment, not only the bishops and the ones who studied, who are well educated, those people who are like so authoritarian to tell sisters what to do and what is right or wrong. We need laws, clear regulations, code of conduct. We have to know who can do something, when to do something, how to do something. Otherwise, it will be mainly abuse, plain abuse, as sexual acts without consensus. This cannot happen, it cannot be tolerated. We need clearer structures, crystal clear ones, in order to report, to receive the complaints, and to be believed as women. For example, sometimes women are not believed for what they go through, okay? So we have to demonstrate twice, for 2 times what happened, and this is scandalous. We need a change in this as well, in the first place. We need clear structures where we can really and truly, say what women do, what women endure, and they have to be believed. This is part, of course, of the gender equality, so we have to work more on that. But I do believe that without this goal in mind, it won't be feasible in the foreseeable years in order to end the sexual and spiritual abuses.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you, Professor. Sorry, okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so thank you, Professor. And so if you have other questions, or we can move to close our press conference.
Can I just, may I?
Sure, sister. Go.
I'd just like to add to what Ute said as far as structures are concerned. You know, structures are very important. But it is not only structures, because you need an attitudinal change. You can have laws, you can have code of conduct, you can have regulations and structures, but if you don't change your attitude, nothing will work, as we see in so many different areas of life. But when we talk of structural support, I think we need to make it very clear that we're talking about a structure that is not controlled by the clergy and the hierarchy. And for that, we need to be part of the dialogue and collaboration and partnership. We need to participate in the decision-making bodies of the church. There needs to be fora for dialogue and reconciliation. We need to have an investigation team amongst the sisters, you know, who takes up situation of abuses of all kinds, economic, spiritual, sexual. And of course, we need to have better working conditions. But I think as structures are concerned, it's a major area that we need to work on.
Thank you, sister. I know that Sister Mumbi would like to add something. Sister Mumbi, you have the floor.
Thank you. You know, there's something else that makes calling out or noticing sexual abuse amongst religious sisters a bit difficult. And this is the whole notion of that they are adults. So we might look at a situation of abuse and we assume that it's a consensual relationship. So there needs to be an understanding of boundaries, of vulnerability, yes, of transactional relationships, yes. I've heard stories from so many religious, ex and current, of situations where, because their basic needs are not being met, because of the shunning that was happening in their own communities or the spiritual abuse, they found solace in the company of a priest or a man. So remember, as you're going to a spiritual advisor or a confessor in a state of vulnerability, that relationship can quickly shift to something else when the person in power, in this question, the priest or the man, exploits that vulnerability, yes, or starts to provide for your needs. It can be a subtle form of coercion to then exchange sexual favors. So in such a situation, we need to grow the term of abuse, because when we think of abuse, many people say it was not violent rape. Violent rape has occurred in instances of religious life, but there's so many more cases of this subtle form of abuse and coercion and manipulation. And Sister Noella says a 30% statistic shocked her. I think if more people were to understand what violation of boundaries and abuse meant, those numbers might actually go a bit higher. And this is where we stop asking victims, why were you with him? But we always used to see you spending time with that person, because we only want abuse to take a certain form or a certain picture in our minds. So we push this narrative that because it was not violent, because I've seen you smiling with them in the past, because of A, B, C, and D, yours does not qualify as abuse. The other thing we need to work on is unearthing our own internalized patriarchy and misogyny that exists to support, defend, and show up men. There's a popular saying that yes, misogyny was created by men, but women work hard to uphold it. We pull down women. We see this in all spheres of life when it comes to abuse. I think of the famous case that happened in the media when a certain judge in the US was being selected for the highest court of the land. And there were questions about what was the woman wearing? Why was she drinking so much? We find all kinds of ways to explain away real abuse. And this is known, and these situations are manipulated so much by men. So we need to expand our understanding, but we also need to teach about boundaries and how easily they can be violated and what power and privilege demands of you, the duty it it bestows on you when you have power and privilege over a vulnerable person. Thank you.
Thank you, sister. I see some comments on the chat. Someone would like to add something, or it's okay? Okay.
Yes, I would just like to comment on what Virginia has said. There cannot be consensual sex between two persons of unequal power. It's the power equation the whole time. It's the powerful that forces the women to do what they want. That's my only comment. I think it's understood by all of us, but I would like to reiterate it, that's all.
Thank you, sister. So I remember you that you could check out the full program of our online conversations on our website, voicesoffaith.org, and you can also follow all our initiatives on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Don't forget to share our initiatives and to tag us. I would like to thank you, all the interpreters, the technical director, and my female team, all female team, and of course, thank you so much to all who have joined today. I'll hand it over to Dr. Susanna Flisowska, Voices of Faith General Manager, for her final remarks and to close. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilda, although doctor is too much. But yes, I would just like to thank you to our speakers today, to Sister Noella, to Sister Mumbi, and to Professor Ute for your remarks that I think gives a very good impression what we will be talking about in these 16 days, because it was so packed that actually I have a feeling that each theme you meant can be discussed for hours. And I think what I liked very much what you said, that there is a constitutional link between human rights and dignity and equality and those abuses. That's something we want to show during these 16 days, naming and accusing structures of sins and showing different kind of abuses, but finishing up with human rights discourse and seeing why it is so difficult for church just to admit that we all have universal human rights and we are all equals, and to let those human rights really reign in our institutions. Sounds simple, but it's not. So we invite you all to follow our 9 events when we will be discussing this. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And if you want to follow us, we will start on November 26th at 4 p.m. Central European Time to say enough to violence against women. Thank you for join our press conference. Bye.